So this week we start with Chapter 7, Common Purpose. Now folks, most of this chapter should be reviewed for you from 3723 and 2723. So I'm going to go through it pretty fast. There are a few places where there's some new points made that I want to emphasize, but I'm really not going to spend a whole lot of time on this chapter because we have talked about this so much before in 2723 and 3723. So what we'll do in this section is to review the key components of common purpose, what we used to call vision in 3723. We'll talk a little bit about what it means to be in a group or be in a team. Again, that's going to be review. I think the somewhat new piece is in the third bullet point, where we'll explore what it means to share a vision and values, something we didn't talk about as much in 3723. And then finally, we'll examine how people work with others to articulate a group's common purpose and come to some decision as to what that common purpose is. Common purpose is what unites groups of people during change. If you remember back in 2723 when you used Kouzes and Posner's leadership challenge, they called this inspiring a shared vision, one of those 5 exemplary leadership practices that they talked about. And they said it had 2 components. One, the ability to envision the future, and secondly, then enlisting others to that vision. Well, your book makes an important point that I want to highlight here. And that is the difference between a personalized vision and a socialized vision. Because Kouzes and Posner's notion of inspiring a shared vision, if you notice, starts off with envisioning the future and then pulling others to that vision. Well, in social change, it doesn't work quite like that. In social change, the vision has to be created collectively. So Kouzes and Posner's notion of vision is much more akin to what happens in business, where a senior leader or a small group of individuals come up with that vision and then sell it to the rest of the people, if you will, and enlist them to follow that vision. Well, in social change, you have to remember the complexity of the issues that are involved with social change. No one person typically has a handle on what needs to be done. And furthermore, if you're going to have any kind of broad, sweeping social change, you need to have everyone feel a sense of ownership over that change process. And that's why Komovies talks about it a little bit differently, and talks about it as a common purpose. And then we'll talk about how it arises within the group. And so this is a very critical distinction that I want you to pay attention to. Because it's not about you, the leader, coming up with the vision and then convincing others to follow it. It's much more about you, the leader, facilitating the group to collectively agree upon what their common purpose is. That's the only way that social change really works. Now, you might remember me talking in 3723 about a team and what makes for a real team. Komovies here describes it as a group, same thing as a team, and defines a group as 3 or more people interacting and communicating interpersonally over time, and here's the critical part, in order to reach a goal. So the goal is shared among the group, and the group needs each other in order to achieve that goal. That's what differentiates this from just a cluster of people that where you just have a bunch of individuals. A true team or a group has this common purpose. Now let's talk for a minute about the components of a common purpose. And this is, you'll find, a pretty traditional way of thinking about common purpose that's applicable not only to social change, but actually to organizations as well. And that is, we talk about three components: a vision, what Comovese calls aims, but what in the business world you would call mission, and values. Now, you've heard me say before that the vision describes the ideal future. A vision should be aspirational. It should be what the group aspires to. So it should define the end state, if you will, down the road that the group hopes to achieve. The aim or the mission is why the group exists. So if you have a group that exists to fight hunger, that's not a vision. That's an aim or a mission. The vision might be to eradicate hunger among the elderly in the United States, for instance. It's a topic I happened to hear on the news just last night, the number of elderly people who starve and go hungry in the United States. So you see that the mission, the aim rather, has to do with fighting hunger. But the vision is aspirational. It's often something that can last for many, many years, because clearly you're not going to eradicate hunger among the elderly in the United States in just a year or two. And that's what makes for a good vision. And that becomes the driving force for the whole organization, or the whole group, is to try and achieve that vision. Now, values has to do with how group members agree to treat themselves and others. And we didn't talk a whole lot about values in 3723, but values become a very big deal in social change. So values might include everything from diversity, that, for example, that we honor the diversity of cultures in fighting this problem. It might be a value about how you interact among the group, that we treat each other with respect and integrity, those kinds of things that guide how you will go about your mission, that is, of fighting hunger, in order to eradicate hunger among the elderly in the United States. So the third key component of a common purpose here is working together. And Comovese makes the point, and it's an excellent one, that you have to practice a very intentional process to develop this common purpose. And if you remember earlier, we said that in social change, you make decisions through consensus. And I told you that arriving at consensus is hard work. It takes time. And you have to stick with it through this process of arriving at consensus. Now, working together is easy if everyone agrees on what needs to be done. But that's pretty rare when you're talking about social change. If you go back to that fundamental thing I keep emphasizing, that social issues are complex. They typically involve multiple cultures, a diverse set of perspectives. And so arriving at that consensus on what needs to be done is effortful, takes time and energy, but without it, if you don't have a shared sense of purpose in your group, you will fail at what you're trying to do. So it's a step that you simply cannot. You might remember in 3723, we talked about different ways to reach decisions. And in fact, we talked about something called the normative decision-making model that would help guide you as to how best to make a decision. And you see here a list that comes from Comovies of different approaches to decision-making. There are a couple of key points to make about this list. First off, remember that we've said that in social change, the answer to what kind of decision-making process is consensus. The others are all perfectly legitimate ways to make decisions in other situations, but not when you're trying to create a group to change or to address change around big social issues. So notice some things in here that you might be very tempted to use. For example, majority control. Let's vote on it. Well, what happens if you have a group that is composed of, let's say, 5 different ethnicities addressing a cultural issue? Like suppose that we want to address joblessness in New Orleans. And we would, if we're doing things right, we would try and put a group together of stakeholders, which would include African American representatives, would include representatives from the Hispanic community. You'd probably have a group from government providers. You'd have a group from private industry. So you'd have, in this case, a mix of different ethnicities as well as provider groups. And suppose you do it by majority control. But suppose that the minority that you leave out is one whole group, one whole subgroup. Maybe you're not addressing the Hispanic needs. You might be able to outvote them, but are they going to participate? Are they going to feel a sense of ownership? And will you solve the problem within the Hispanic community? The answer to that is no. It means that you've ignored something important to that particular subgroup, and that's why we have to use a consensus decision-making process. Comovies offers these 4 critical steps for reaching group consensus, and this is a good model to guide you. First off, you have to clearly define the issue facing the team. Now, this may look like a no-brainer, but let me tell you, it's often not. Use that example I was just talking about, joblessness in New Orleans, or unemployment. On the surface, it may look like joblessness. But suppose when you really start talking with the group, there's some related issues such as poverty or lack of role models that tie into this issue. And so to really solve it, you have to accurately define the issue. You may be seeing only the tip of the iceberg, but to really reach consensus, you have to fully define what the components are of the issue. So that's a key step and something that you need to make sure you allot time for. Secondly, to focus on similarities between the positions. Anytime you pull a group together to address a social issue, there are going to be differences in perspective, and we're going to talk about that at length in the next chapter. Your goal here is not for one group to win or to have their opinion win over another group. It's to find common ground. And the more you search for that common ground and the more you can keep the group focused on the similarities between the different perspectives, the more successful you're going to be at reaching consensus. The third point is just so critical, is that you have to make time, adequate time for discussion. And I will tell you that many people get frustrated with the process because they like to put timelines on it. Say, okay, we're going to spend the next 30 days to come up with our common purpose. And then 30 days comes and the group is still discussing, and they get all frustrated and try and tell the group, folks, we have to get this done, we have to finish it, etc. And that is not the way to come up with a consensus around a common purpose that will really drive a group to successful change. The discussion takes a life of its own, and you have to provide adequate time for it. And then the fourth point is to avoid what are called conflict reducing tendencies. And again, we're going to talk a lot all about conflict in the next chapter. But what this means is, using the example I just gave you, the 30 days has come, so let's just take a vote. Well, that just shuts down conversation. It shuts down the consensus-making decision process. It may feel like you're ending conflict. But as we'll talk in Chapter 8, conflict is not a bad thing. It just means you haven't found the common ground yet. And of course, coming up with a consensus is not without its challenges. Sometimes you have individuals who are just simply not flexible and have their own agenda, their own personalized vision, and aren't willing to engage in a group decision-making process. And this is where you, the leader, comes in, and this is where the values come in. Because if you've defined the values correctly, then you can hold group members accountable to those values. So if you've defined the value that you will achieve group consensus and you will respect and honor different perspectives, and you have one individual who's not doing that, you, the leader, have the ability to step in and hold them accountable to those values. It is possible for groups to become paralyzed. This is the real role of the leader, is to keep facilitating the process so at least the process moves and doesn't just go around and round and round in circles and not make any real progress. Sometimes this is hard work, folks. I have led some groups that are the community groups that are the toughest facilitation challenge that I've ever had, because of the diversity of perspectives, the diversity of ideas about how to solve the problems. But you, the leader, have to be the one who has the tenacity to keep the process moving and keep making progress. Even if you have to look for just little steps, little wins along the way, little things the group can agree to, and keep building and building and building until you have the larger consensus. And then thirdly, there are groups like groups of college students that have revolving memberships. It's difficult to have a sustained vision and mission and common purpose because the membership keeps changing.
And you have this, you almost have to reform the group every year or so.
So in summary, common purpose, that shared sense of vision and aims and values, is an incredibly powerful force once you get there. If you've ever been part of a group that had this sense of shared common purpose, you know that the energy, the enthusiasm in those groups is amazing. And when you really get people pulling together, all aiming toward one thing, you really can accomplish amazing things as a group. And so I think this is the essence of leading, is being able to get the group to the point where they can embrace that common purpose. And that's why I keep emphasizing that you have to give the process the time that's necessary, because the payoff on the other side, once you get that common purpose and you get people bought into that common purpose, is amazing things that can be accomplished. And you remember, one of the things I may have told you is people don't resist that which they help create. And that's what we're talking about here. That if you give the group the opportunity to collectively create that common purpose, they will embrace it. And then you'll be on your way to successful change.